yesterday, if you follow the cricket, you'll know this already, the men's Ashes Test match at Lord's was interrupted after a protester from the Just Stop Oil campaign group ran onto the ground.
Look at this, we've got people running on. Wow. This is terrible.
Oh, Johnny B's gone for it.
Bairstow's there, orange smoke and dust. They're trying to keep them off the pitch. Protesters, 2 of them. They've managed to keep them off the pitch. And Johnny Bairstow is taking one of the protesters off, is carrying him off towards the grandstand. Another one is prostrate on the ground. They haven't managed to damage the pitch.
No.
But they've thrown some orange stuff around.
There you are. I think he meant prostrate on the ground. Those commentators are amazing, aren't they? They just keep going. Whatever happens, they just keep talking about it. The campaign group, as I say, is Just Stop Oil, and they say they're staging these kinds of protests. You'll remember the Crucible with the snooker as well recently, in order to raise awareness of climate change, yes, but also in order to encourage the media to tell the truth about the climate crisis that this planet is facing. The basic claim of the organisation, Just Stop Oil, is really they need to do this kind of thing in order to get the media platform that they need to tell the story, because the media is not doing its job properly. Chloe Naldrett is with us, spokesperson for Just Stop Oil. Does that fairly summarise the overall ambition of these kinds of protests? Chloe, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. And yes, yeah, it absolutely does. So I'm really grateful for that analysis that you've offered there. We're not doing these protests for fun. We're doing it because the situation we're in it requires urgent attention, and we're doing protests like this because they're working. Actions like this equal invitations to have conversations like this on the media. And look, basically everything that we're doing is a bit of an experiment, because humanity's never faced a crisis like this before. So, we're learning from civil resistance movements of the past, like, the suffragettes and the civil rights marches and, LGBTQ rights and workers' rights. But essentially, there is no blueprint for the scale of the change that we need. So everything is an experiment. But right now, protests like this are getting us into the kind of conversations that we need to be having on programmes like this every single day.
Two very contrasting responses immediately as you're speaking there, Chloe. Andrew says, you can think what you like about Just Stop Oil, folks, but their protest strategy is working. Here they are being discussed and awarded more publicity on Talkback on this occasion. They're all over the news. Gerald in Belfast says climate change receives enough coverage. Just Stop Oil are a bunch of self-righteous bullies attempting to impose their views on the public. So obviously the public, as you know, you could predict it yourself, will be divided about these protests and also about what's behind the protests. Now, what is centrally behind these protests here is the claim that the media is failing to do its job, to tell the truth about what is happening with our climate and with this planet. So lay out the evidence that you have for us that would support that claim that the media is failing to do its job there.
Sure. So, I think we have to go back a step and look at what the government should be doing. So in 2015, the British government was a signatory to the Paris Agreement, which is the most important piece of climate legislation that has ever existed. And in that legislation, they, alongside other world leaders, pledged to reduce their emissions, but also really significantly, they committed to telling their citizens exactly what's going on, what climate change is, what's causing it, and what we can do about it. And our government has not kept either one of their pledges. Our emissions are not falling at anything like the rate that they need to fall at. And in fact, the Lord's protest yesterday wasn't even the most important climate story of the day. The most important climate story of the day yesterday was the fact that the government's own climate change committee, headed up by Lord Debon, who's a Conservative peer, said we are behind on every single one of our targets to get us to our net zero strategy. It's just not going to happen because we are nowhere near. So that's the most important story of yesterday. So the government is not telling that it's not reducing its emissions, and it's not communicating with people in a way that gives us to understand that the climate crises that we're seeing, the weather events that we're seeing are connected to the food shortages. They're connected to the rise in inflation. They're connected to the fact that people can't afford their groceries. It's connected to the fact that people can't afford their energy bills. It's connected to the fact that people's homes are being flooded, that 60 homes in the UK went up in flames last year when temperatures topped 40 degrees. So, we're not being told about how all of these things connect with each other. And the media is really good at holding activists to account for the kind of actions that we took like yesterday, but it's not holding the government to account. And that's where we need the media to really, really step up here. We've got reports all over the place. We've got scientists screaming. The IPCC's sixth report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which finished coming out earlier this year, it's really clear. Code red for humanity, an atlas of human suffering. We're on a highway to climate hell with our foot on the accelerator. Where is the discussion about that?
I saw interviews with Lord Deben, the former John Gummer, yesterday. Channel 4 News had a featured interview with him, for example. I'm looking at a BBC webpage from yesterday. Climate Change Committee says UK no longer a world leader, which includes an interview with Lord Deben, the committee chair, leaving that role as committee chair at this point. So I guess we need to break this down a bit. When we say the media is not telling the truth, the BBC reported that story that you think is the number one story yesterday. Channel 4 reported that story yesterday as well. Who do you have in mind?
Well, I guess it's in the news cycle, isn't it? But because we've got this 24-hour constant news cycle, it gets pushed down the agenda really quickly. And so it gets reported, in some places, in some papers. It's certainly not being reported by papers like the Daily Mail, that which speaks to an awful lot of people in this country, and they are just flat out denial. So, but in the media cycles where we do see it reported, it just falls down the list. What we're not getting is broadcasters and editors and journalists saying, "Hang on a minute, we need to have serious discussions about this." And what is brilliant is that programs like this are inviting people like me in to come and have this discussion. But why aren't you talking to the oil executives and the banks and the government?
So, Chloe, again, you mentioned the Daily Mail. I immediately click on it. I'm now looking at an interview with Lord Deben yesterday on the Daily Mail, a video interview, which is headlined "Lord Deben calls government climate policy pathetic." They also do a story saying anger as climate watchdog chairman Lord Deben says ministers should learn from Just Stop Oil fanatics. They use the word fanatics in that headline, but the Mail is covering it. So where's the evidence that the public's not being told?
Well, the Mail might be covering it, but the editorial tone of the Mail in respect of the climate crisis and the actions that we're seeing,
tone,
that's absolutely their tone about it. So it's constantly undermining the issue, even when it's talking about it, which is giving people the impression that it's all overblown and it's all out of proportion. It's not. It's simply the editorial tone is really important here, and these publications that are trusted by people have got such an obligation to give people the correct information and to draw the connections between the things that ordinary people care about and are worried about, because everything that we are concerned about ultimately derives from the climate and the sort of planetary emergency that we're in at the moment.
81771 Neil says the media absolutely does not tell the truth about climate change because the reality is there is no climate emergency, he says. Well, he doesn't believe that. Alan Love says banning the use of fossil fuels is a futile attempt to mitigate the unlikely consequences of a disproven hypothesis. Okay. So there are still deniers out there.
There's evidence for the problem, isn't there?
No, there are deniers out there.
There are deniers because the information that they're getting is permitting them to deny. And the fact is that the information from the scientists, the leading scientists in the world who form that Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that I mentioned earlier, there is absolute scientific consensus. Sure. They know exactly what's happening. They know what's causing it. And brilliantly, the most recent part of their report says, here are all the things that we can do about it. Real world solutions, not magic, not miracles, but all we need is the political will to implement those things.
Catherine Dunn's also with us. Let's welcome Catherine into the conversation. Catherine is content editor at the Oxford University Climate Journalism Network. Hi, Catherine. Welcome. Good to have you with us. Can you give us, as you monitor and survey media coverage, journalistic coverage of climate change, can you give us a sense of whether journalism in the UK is doing a decent job of getting that story across to the public?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can, yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it might help if I give a little bit of context about what we actually do. So we're based at the Reuters Institute, which is an institute for journalism, and we run research programs, we have fellowships. But the main thing we do is that every 6 months we get 100 journalists from around the world, and we do a 6-month course that's very focused on climate literacy. So I would say that we work with journalists in the UK, but they're a minority of who we speak to. And in general, we're looking at a global perspective. Is the media doing, in general, giving sufficient coverage of climate change?
Yeah, let's come to that.
No. But I would say the more nuanced aspect here is, for some organizations and in some countries, it's the pure kind of knowledge, right? The IPCC report, the COP coverage, this kind of bread and butter climate coverage. But it's also that sort of contextual intersectional knowledge that we're talking about that we're very focused on, which is that it's not always about having more stories. It's about stories that give you the background and the context. It's a business story. It's a politics story. It's a sports story. It's a culture story that will have that extra little bit of context about how is affecting it. So I would say broadly no, but I would say it's not always about just having more coverage. It's about having different kinds of coverage and more nuanced coverage.
So, for example, inflation. We've been talking a lot about the cost of living crisis, interest rates, inflation, all the rest of it. You rarely hear a climate dimension to the inflation story as it's reported in the UK.
Yeah, that is true. And actually, that's something that's quite easy to work on, right? Is that little bit of extra context, which is that, okay, we're in a period of incredible flux where all of our seasons and our patterns are being thrown out of whack. And this affects, fundamentally agriculture, and it affects energy, right? So the inflation is very much, even leaving aside the war in Ukraine, it's a very much a climate story. And sometimes that's about putting a line in there, that's about putting a couple of lines. It's not about tagging it climate, putting it on the climate page. It's about saying, like, as our seasons become more unpredictable, as we're seeing drought, as we're seeing crops fail, it is pushing up the cost of food. And this is something, very fundamental. And I will say that as inflation climbed last year, this was something that, we're hearing in the UK from journalists, but actually we're hearing almost every single country. They're saying, my editor says inflation is the top story. And we say, well, go back to your editor, because it's a climate story. It is. And it's about...
And push back and try to make it that. Thank you, Catherine. Yeah. Really appreciate it. Catherine Dunn there from the Oxford Climate Journalism Network. Kate here texts to say, I note the irony in this programme, now discussing the climate crisis, having spent over 30 minutes telling us where we could fly to on our holidays and which might be cheaper. Thousands of flights leaving Ireland and the UK every day, says Kate. Fair comment. Can't argue with that. Newton Emerson's there too, the journalist and broadcaster. Hi, Newton.
Good afternoon.
Do you think the media is not doing its job? The media here in the UK, journalism in the UK and Ireland, not doing its job telling the public the truth about climate change?
Well, it's certainly trying, and I think this is very unfair on Sky News in particular. I don't know if you're aware that 2 years ago it handed over a half-hour slot of its primetime evening section to the Daily Climate Show, the first daily primetime news show dedicated to climate change, and ran that for over a year, but had to axe it because everyone switched off. It's hundreds of thousands of people.
Couldn't get the ratings.
They couldn't get the ratings. Now, perhaps, as your last guest is pointing out there, that wasn't. It was too focused. It didn't bring in other stories and help people to relate to it. And, I mean, you can certainly do this. I must pay tribute to our own Shauna Core on the Daily Mirror in Northern Ireland. I don't know if you've ever read the Earth's Core, the climate column she's been given, and has really made this fantastically readable, crusading and investigative page. It can be done, but
But is that part of the problem? Is that part of to turn climate stories into niche side stories when climate is involved in every aspect of the stories we cover, from Ukraine and the cost of living crisis to pretty much every story these days, Newton? Why make it a niche side story?
Well, perhaps it's the local angle that has enabled Shauna to make such a good go of it, or to help. Whereas the Sky programme, because it took the global view, just felt a lot like hectoring, and also a story that I think that we've heard before. So it's difficult to keep the public entertained.
Yeah.
You've got to accept that these are businesses. They are news businesses. They have to, they have to make money, and the BBC also, of course, has to justify a universal licence fee. So it is an audience challenge in addition to the scientific problem. But there is also, I think, this problem with reporting science stories. Really, you would have hoped that the pandemic would have sorted this out, but it's only made it worse. You can't report science stories as he said, she said. But on the other hand, you can't just report them as a purely factual basis. A scientific theory must be falsifiable. It can't be right unless it can also be wrong. And science isn't a democracy. You can't say 99% of scientists agree, so that's it, because that doesn't work either. So there needs to be, I think, a new approach to report, a new agreement in the media about how to understand and report science stories, not as debates, but still not as this awful expression, the science is settled, is a scientifically illiterate concept.
Got it, yeah. But you can't have two people sitting in a studio, one who represents 99% consensus on science on a subject, and the other given equal time who represents less than 1%, and say, well, they are, flip a coin. That's not how science works either. Back in the days of HIV and AIDS debates, the early reporting, there were some very significant scientists who denied that HIV caused AIDS. They had a phenomenally negative impact in various parts of the world, not least South Africa. I went to South Africa and made a program there about the fact that the then president of South Africa followed that AIDS denialism, didn't allow drugs for HIV into the country, and tens of thousands of people lost their lives in South Africa.
I think part of the problem with this for the BBC in particular is it has become terrified of being seen to be patrician, Reithian, and to lecture people, even though scientific lectures at Christmas are some of its most popular. and loved
the Royal
programmes.
Institute,
Yes, and perhaps that is what we should go back to, especially in public service broadcasting, is not to be afraid to have an educated and intelligent lecture. Why not? What is wrong with that?
Let's take a call from Jordan in Newton Arts. Hi, Jordan.
Hi, mate. How's it going?
Going well. Go ahead.
My question just was for the speaker. I apologise, I've forgotten her name.
Chloe.
The girl you had on, Chloe. It was just basically just to ask Chloe what it is that she would like the government to do.
Thanks, Jordan. Chloe.
What would I like the government to do?
How long have you got?
Well, the demand of Just Stop Oil is very, very simple, and the clue is in the name. Our government is currently looking to licence 100 new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. It's opening new coal mines, and those are simply incompatible with a habitable future for everyone alive now and for our children. So that's the very, very clear demand of Just Stop Oil is not allowing those licences to go ahead, because as we just talked earlier about the Climate Change Committee, they are saying that we can't license those new fossil fuel fields. That's also being said by the UN, by the International Energy Agency, and by the British Medical Association, among hundreds of bodies who are all saying we cannot take new oil and gas out of the ground. We've got to have a just transition. So we've got to use the reserves that we have already identified and that we're already in possession of to sort of see us through a period in which we absolutely go hell for leather to renewable, clean, sustainable energy sources, and that is the task ahead of us in the next decade.
Jordan, you're happy enough?
If we don't start that now, then we have lost hope.
Jordan, you're happy enough with that answer?
Yeah, to a point. Yeah, I just feel that if the government did banish all them and decided just to go right, we're going to try and go fully green. I just feel that other countries in the world that aren't committing to it the same way, I feel like it would make such a little impact if the UK did do that. It would make a massive impact on everyone's lives in the UK, but I don't feel like we're towards.
We need to get China on board, India and other countries.
I think that's a really important.
Yeah,
I think that's a really important concern,
but
there's two things here. One is that we do produce a disproportionate amount of fossil fuels, and we contribute a disproportionate amount of funding to fossil fuel infrastructure and development across the world. So what we do here in the UK is really significant. And just, every conversation I have on this topic comes back. Someone says, "Well, going to China. Why don't you go to China? China are the problem." China is ahead of its own targets. It's basically tripled solar energy in the last 3 years. It's tripled it in 2 years, and they're going to hit their targets.
They're also
5
building
years
coal-fired power stations.
They are, but China is an enormous country.
You have to look at it in the round. I get it.
You have to look at it around, and also they make things for the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But the fact is that there is some coal infrastructure still going on in China, and that's problematic. But they are also mobilising towards renewables much faster than anybody else is.
Chloe, just in the final few minutes, because I want to keep the focus on the media and whether the media is doing its job in terms of telling this story. I mean, Newton makes a good point, doesn't he, about the lack of interest often amongst the public. When you look at the BBC website and it shows you the most read stories or the most popular stories of the day, it's rarely these kinds of stories across the board. How do you advise media storytellers, that's what journalists are, to tell this story in a way that really does grip the public's imagination and make them want to listen, want to watch, and want to learn?
Well, I think what needs to happen is the threat to everybody, to everyone that we love, everyone that everything that we care about needs to be made clear. Because once I became aware of the threat to my children and to the things that I love and the world that I love living in, it switched me on emotionally, and it made it impossible for me not to take action. So that needs to be achieved on a much wider scale. And the reality is, it's really discomforting. It's not news that you want to hear. And so there's a little bit of going, we've got to take responsibility and tell people this information that they don't want, but they need. It's not about what we want, it's about what we need. Because we can only be empowered to act in our own interest.
But does that mean scaring
if we're
people?
Properly aware of what we're facing. And just to sort of be really clear, this is about the air that we breathe. It's about us having enough water to live. It's about our food. It's about the security of our homes. It's about the functioning economy in which we all live. This is about absolutely everything. And until that's made clear, until that really uncomfortable truth is talked about in a way that makes people understand what's at stake, we're not going to get anywhere.
Thank you very much, Chloe Naldrett, who's the spokesperson for Just Stop Oil. Thanks also to the broadcaster and journalist Newton Emerson. That's it from us. You can, of course, as you're doing already, continue to respond to that and other items on the show on the hashtag BBC Talkback. Send us an email to talk.back@bbc.co.uk with a story you want us to talk about. We will. Thank you very much. Here's Hugo.